This episode is brought to you by Sterling Soap Company. Fellas, you've heard the phrase, look good, feel good, right? But why not add smell good to that too? That's where Sterling Soap Company comes in. First, Sterling Soap is 100% natural and has a wide variety of bath soaps, shave soaps, beard balm, lotions, and cologne. Second, there's a scent just for you. How about burgundy? Yeah, it's more than a color. The Sterling Soap folks blend natural essential oils with hints of mahogany, golden amber, and sandalwood. Or how about D503, an intensely masculine scent inspired by Legend by Mont Blanc. And third, you will feel good about the price. For just a little more than you'd pay at the grocery store, Sterling Soap will leave you feeling clean, refreshed, and ready for whatever's next. Give Sterling Soap a try today. Visit sterlingsoap.com.
Hey there, sports history fan. This is Darren Hayes, host of the Pigskin Dispatch and Jersey Dispatch podcast. I hope you've enjoyed another great episode here on Sports History Network. Now, speaking of sports history, this episode was brought to you by Firefly Books, and they have two great ones for you this summer. For basketball fans, they have the NBA 75, the definitive history by author Dave Zarum, who's appeared on our Jersey Dispatch podcast recently. He tells about the experience, the thrilling journey of the NBA, from its humble beginnings to its modern glory. Uncover the untold stories of triumph, controversy, and the greatest stars of the game. This isn't just a book, it's courtside seats to over 75 years of NBA history. And for the golf enthusiasts, swing into The Golf Round I'll Never Forget by Matt Adams. Relive 50 of golf's most memorable moments through the eyes of the legends themselves. From Garcia's triumph at the 2017 Masters to Nicklaus' miraculous 1986 comeback, it's the closest you'll get to walking the fairways with golf's greatest. Get your summer read on. Grab a copy of NBA 75 or The Golf Round I'll Never Forget, available online or at your favorite bookstore.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Name the only player in the history of Major League Baseball to hit at least 50 home runs in 1 year and strike out less than 50 times in that same season. Next on Sports Forgotten Heroes, I'll give you the answer.
This is Sports Forgotten Heroes, a tribute to the stars who shaped the games we love to watch and the games we love to play. Stars who provided us with many thrills, but when their time was up, they faded away. We'll take a look back at their spectacular careers, their moments of fame, even if it was just for one season or just one game. And now, here's your host, Warren Rogan.
Hello and welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes, episode number 156, Johnny Mize. Now, as you might suspect, the answer to that trivia question, the only player in the history of Major League Baseball to hit at least 50 home runs in a season and strike out less than 50 times, well, it's Johnny Mize. That's right. In 1947, Johnny Mize hit 51 home runs and only struck out 42 times while playing for the New York Giants. In fact, for his career, Johnny Mize averaged just 45 strikeouts a year while averaging 31 home runs a year. An incredible stat. And I always thought it was the most impressive thing about the career of Johnny Mize. But in research for this episode of Sports Forgotten Heroes, in reading the book by Jerry Grillo, The Big Cat, I found out something even more unique about the career of Johnny Mize. It wasn't what he did on the field. It is the relationship he had with Ty Cobb and the relationship he had with Babe Ruth. In fact, Johnny Mize was related to both of them. Completely blew my mind. And on this episode of Sports Forgotten Heroes, we're going to talk about that with Jerry Grillo. Now, Mize was, in my estimation, severely overlooked. He played 15 years of Major League Baseball, During that time, he hit 359 home runs and knocked in 1,337 runs. His first 6 years was with the St. Louis Cardinals. Then he played 5 years with the New York Giants. Now, those 5 years were interrupted by a 3-year stint in World War II. Then he played 5 years with the New York Yankees. And during that 5-year span with the Yankees, he won the World Series each and every season. 1949, 1950, 1951, and 1952, and 1953. And in 1952, a year in which he really only had a part-time role with the Yankees. In fact, for his career with the Yankees, he really became a part-time player. Johnny Mize in 1952 played just 78 games, and he only hit 4 home runs the entire year. But in the playoffs, Johnny Mize played in 5 games, 15 at-bats, and had 3 home runs. What a postseason for Johnny Mize. For his career, he hit .312, like I said, 359 home runs, 1,337 RBI, and had a career OPS of .959. Again, overlooked, a spectacular career, and he was not elected into the Hall of Fame until 1981 by the Veterans Committee. Jerry Grillo, author of The Big Cat, The Life of Baseball Hall of Famer Johnny Mize, will join me on today's episode to talk about the career of this great first baseman. Before we get there, however, please follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on X at Sports F Heroes. Look for the Sports Forgotten Heroes page on Facebook, and please follow, rate, and review wherever it is you get your podcasts. Hey, if you want to get in touch, shoot me an email. Send it to sportsfh.info@gmail.com. That's sportsfh.info@gmail.com. And as always, I thank you for your support. Okay, let's get into today's show with my guest, Jerry Grillo. Jerry, welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes. I am thrilled that you're here.
Glad to be here, Warren. Really, really happy. Thanks for having me, man.
Absolutely. There is what I consider to be a famous trivia question, which is, name the only player in the history of baseball to hit at least 50 home runs in a season and strike out less than 50 times. Only one player has ever done it, and that is Johnny Mize.
Indeed.
But that got trumped after I read your book. And one of the most interesting things to me, and we're going to get into a whole bunch of different things, is the fact that Johnny Mize, I never knew this, is related to Ty Cobb and Babe Ruth. That completely blew me away. So I want to start with that. How is he related to Ty Cobb? How is he related to Babe Ruth? And why is that not as popular as
That's a great question. Now you hit one of those $1 million questions, because I had heard this. Of course, I had done a little research, and actually Johnny wrote about it in his book. One of the reasons it's not widely known, for example, is not many people know that Johnny wrote a book, for one thing, and it was called How to Hit. Great title, and it really did. It was How to Hit. It was very plain spoken, and it was a fairly popular book for its time. Well, in the book, Johnny tells a few personal stories, and one of them is about his cousin, Ty Cobb. coming to visit him in a locker room after a ball game. And Ty is quite old at this point in his life, and Johnny, I think, is a veteran by now in New York. And he tap on his shoulder, and he turns around, and there's Ty Cobb, probably 50 something, and he says, "Hey, I understand we're cousins, Johnny." And Johnny's like, "I always knew that, but I didn't." This is how shy he was. "I always knew that, but I didn't want to acknowledge it in public until you had said something first." And these are two grown men, and so yeah, he was on his father's side. Ty Cobb and Ty Cobb was sort of a second cousin to Johnny's father, so it sort of made him a second and a half cousin to Johnny. But they were blood kin, as they say. Babe Ruth is an even more interesting kind of tie-in. Johnny's second cousin, or first cousin once removed, Claire Hodgson, grew up actually in the town where close to where I live now, where I'm the editor of the local newspaper, Cleveland, Georgia. And Claire became Mrs. Babe Ruth. That was Babe's second wife in the 1920s. And so Johnny, when he became a major leaguer, of course, he would travel to New York, first with the Cardinals, then he was stationed there as a Giant and Yankee. He'd go visit his cousin George, as he called him, cousin George and cousin Claire, on their Riverside Drive apartments. So they were quite close. And but it's funny, he didn't make that big a deal out of it. And it wasn't until I think Johnny was chasing Babe Ruth's record the year he hit the 51 homers, that sort of became part of the news, where, hey, they're cousins, and Babe would like to see Johnny keep the record in the family, that kind of thing.
Did Ty Cobb or Babe Ruth ever, I don't know, take Johnny under their wing, help Johnny? What kind of baseball relationship did Johnny Mize have with both or either?
Right. Well, surprisingly, very little. Johnny was very much a self-made kind of ball player. He was from a weird in the sense that they were very quiet, stick to themselves kind of family. And so he probably wasn't even aware that Cobb was a cousin until, well, he probably knew about it as a teenager, I think, growing up in Demarest, which is only about 25 maybe miles from where Ty Cobb grew up. And so there was definitely, for example, I found out that one of the guys who worked at Piedmont College, where Johnny played as a teenager, played baseball with Ty Cobb as a youth in Royston. So there was probably some knowledge, but never really a lot of sharing of the knowledge, if you will. Babe was supportive of Johnny, and liked him and that kind of thing. But I think by that time in Johnny's career, he was already a major leaguer, and the Babe was, he wasn't much of a coach. I think he would have gladly given tips. One thing that Babe did do for Johnny, I think in a way to help him psychologically, was he gave him one of his bats, and he had this plaque made, which it was like a symbol of Babe's 60 home runs and this kind of thing. And it was to sort of inspire Johnny. This is when Johnny was very young, maybe his first or second year as a major leaguer. And so Babe did that for him. And, he wanted to inspire him that way.
What was it about, out of all the baseball players there are, obviously many books written about Ty Cobb and Babe Ruth and, the legends, the big legends of the game. Not that Johnny's not a legend. He's an underappreciated legend, I think. But what was it about Johnny Mize that struck your fancy and says, you know what, I got to write a book about Johnny Mize?
Well, I think he was one of those acquired tastes. He seemed like one of those rare jewels. As you said, a lot of books have been written about Ty Cobb and Babe Ruth. And as a baseball fan, longtime baseball fan, and especially of baseball history and some of the forgotten heroes, if you will, I grew up in a household where, like, my dad was, I wouldn't say a rabid baseball fan, but he was a nostalgic baseball fan. He would take me and my brothers to games, but he would talk a lot about the old Yankees of the early 50s and late 40s. when Johnny Mize was an old player, but a key figure for a team that won 5 straight championships. And Dad would tell these stories about these old time guys that to us, they seemed like, legends from King Arthur, this kind of thing. And then fast forward a little bit, Dad takes us to a old timer game, and there's Johnny Mize playing as an old man on the ball field. And, there's all these superstars there, like guys you reference, you think of these Mickey Mantle, Willie Mays, Stan Musial. And Dad was glad to see all these guys from his youth, but he was more excited about seeing Mize because of the fact that he was this sort of rare thing, that jewel the old gunfighter. In Dad's point of view, he was sort of the old gunfighter that Casey Stengel brought to the Yankees to help the team in the pinch, and thus he was this great pinch hitter as an old man with the Yankees. And so that stayed with me. Didn't feed my interest to write a book about him. What happened is I moved to where I now live, which is Northeast Georgia, and I live about 15 miles from Demarest, the town where Johnny lived and died. And I was the newspaper editor there for a short time in that county, and I met his daughter. Johnny had died, but his daughter was still living in the old house. She introduced herself to me, and we became friends. And after learning a little bit more about her father, the man, after a couple of years, I had even left the newspaper. I asked her if I could write a biography about her dad, and she said she would love that. And so I started working on it, and that's kind of how it led to. It was a combination of this historical knowledge, this nostalgia, and also there hadn't been much written about him. There just wasn't much out there, and I thought he was an underappreciated hero. The more I learned about him and his time and the different adventures he had that were relatively unknown, the more I became fascinated in who this guy was.
I think if you're a fan of baseball and you have any appreciation for the history of the game, or at least you've heard of the name Johnny Mize. You might not know much about his game, but you've definitely heard about it. So, to the best of your ability, how would you describe Johnny Mize at the plate? What made him such a dominant hitter?
The thing that sort of made Johnny Mize a great hitter, and this goes back to when he was a child, growing up a few miles away from here, in a town that was so small, there weren't enough boys to get up a sandlot baseball team, and or a high school team for that matter. There was a local college, and they had a baseball team, but the little kids, they found games like tennis easier to play because it only took 2 guys, so this is what I'm getting to. Johnny would get hold of a broken bat from the college. They would give away broken bats to the local kids, and he would practice hitting tennis balls against the side of a building. Instead of using a tennis racket, he would use a baseball bat. He developed an incredible hitting eye by, doing this volley with a bat instead of a tennis racket. Helped his tennis game too. He was a tennis champion as a teenager, but then of course he was quickly became a great hitter when he took up baseball as a kid. Actually, mainly as a teenager. He played a little bit as a 10, 12-year-old, but it wasn't until he was a teenager and the college coach at the local college saw how big he was at 15 and how hard he can hit a baseball with his friends when they were goofing around. He decided to call him out and that's really kind of how it happened. That's how he developed that hitting eye. And then Warren, frankly, he took a scientific approach. He studied pitchers. He studied their habits, very much like a Ted Williams.
It's exactly what just came to mind when you said that. I
right.
The Ted Williams book. What was it? The Science of Hitting.
The Science of Hitting.
Yeah.
Yes, I love it. With the chart, with the famous.
Yeah.
You know what? That's an interesting chart. I've looked at it a lot and thought about how it does help describe a little bit of what Mize was like too. I do think Mize didn't strike out much at all. I mean, he was a guy who, again, he's known for making contact as much as hitting for power. I think that sort of chart that Ted Williams put together would be applicable to a hitter like Mize. He was very disciplined. He didn't go for pitches outside the strike zone unless, he was one of those guys that if he knew he could hit the pitch and drive in a run, he would go for it. But most of the time, he was very disciplined about that. And I think that's part of what made him a great hitter. His discipline. I think he was never very much of a big free swinger.
Yeah, if you think about his discipline at the plate and compare it to the players of today, Johnny played for 15 years, missed 3 seasons due to being in the military, and over 15 years of baseball, a power hitter. I mean, he had 359 home runs for his career. He averaged only 45 strikeouts a season. I can't even fathom a ball player of today with that kind of discipline.
Right.
But here's an interesting question for you, Jerry. I don't know if you can answer this. In doing all these podcasts, there is a common theme with some of the greats of yesteryear, and that is, I don't know if the term would be they wear out their welcome, but no matter how good some of these guys were, teams were always eager to trade them away.
Yes.
And Johnny, to me, is one of those guys. Came up with the Cardinals, and it wasn't very long before the Cardinals were looking to trade him.
Yep.
Why? Why would you trade a guy? Let's see, in his 6 years with the Cardinals, he had a batting average of .336. He hit 158 home runs. That teams would kill for that.
Right.
Why would the Cardinals want to get rid of a guy like that?
Well, there are a few reasons. One, the team always seemed to be stacked. They had such a deep and rich farm system. They were the Cardinals were ahead of everybody else in building that sort of homegrown talent. And so that was one thing. There was certainly nobody as good as Mize playing behind him. So it wasn't like there was another hungry slugger who could hit for average coming up. But the Cardinals under Branch Rickey as general manager were also very cheap and sometimes impatient. Like, for example, Johnny was one of those guys that would hold out year after year for more money. And that would get under Branch Rickey's skin. From the time he was a rookie, Mize had the audacity to hold out. I think the Cardinals felt he should have been more beholden to them because they, paid for the operation that saved his career. But, this was a different time when, players were not, treated as valuably as they are today, right? So the fact that Johnny got, the surgery, saved his career and succeeded, it's the first time I've actually discussed this, Warren. It occurred to me just today, really, that this idea that, the Cardinals were a cheapskate kind of team. That's certainly a lot of the teams were back then, but the Cardinals were sort of notorious for having some good players who were underpaid. And Branch Rickey was a master, businessman. He liked to get rid of guys when they were just before their peak so he can get maximum value. And I think a lot of those things came into play for Johnny. There were other players available that they thought might fit better in their system. So it's hard to say, but I think Johnny, for his part, learned early on that baseball was a business more than it was a game. I think he enjoyed the job, he enjoyed the work, but he I think from a very early age realized, okay, this is a business. I'm in it for myself. There was no such thing as agents, anything like this. So.
Yeah, I just finished a podcast. It's the one that aired previous to this one about Danny Gardella. And Gardella did not have the kind of career that Mize had, did not have the cachet that Johnny Mize had. So you're saying here that Johnny would hold out for more, sort of challenging the reserve clause in a way, but for certain players that works because of just how good they were. Danny did it after 2 years and it sort of wrecked his career. Now, interestingly enough, Johnny went from the Cardinals to the New York Giants and, had a phenomenal career. Gardella went from the Giants to the Cuban League, then to the Cardinals. So in a way, we're talking about two franchises. Since you did bring it up, talk about the operation.
Sure. Johnny had this weird injury, if you will. It was discovered when he pulled a muscle running out I guess it was a double while playing in the minor leagues for Rochester. And so, but on further inspection, the injury didn't go away. And so he actually happened to be in Montreal, which was a minor league city at the time, an international league. Rochester was there, and they had a great hospital and some excellent surgeons and doctors who inspected him, and they discovered he had these calcium deposits, this growth on his pelvis, and it's the sort of injury that is more typical in members of the the cavalry in the army, guys who ride horses hard and fast over bumpy terrain. Well, it turns out Johnny had done some of that as a kid. That he had, as a kid growing up in the country, he had done some riding, probably over, and this area here is rather bumpy and rocky. I can imagine that had some effect. And also the fact that this was a sort of injury that you occasionally see in young athletes who do a lot of running. And he being a heavy guy, maybe that led to it. And who knows, the chemistry behind this kind of injury, but he developed these calcium deposits, like these pointy, icicles on his bone that were incredibly painful. Every movement was hurting as these tore into his muscle. He lived with this for a while, and then he re-injured himself. They rediscovered this injury a year later, and he laid out for a while, and try to come back, which was not long lasting. And so ultimately, the Surgeon General at the time, Robert Hyland, he was known as the Surgeon General of baseball, and he was actually the Cardinals team doctor. He was based in St. Louis, and used to work on players almost like for free. It was a weird time. It was like an honor for him to work on So Johnny, of course, he got the surgery. I think the Cardinals, for something like this was a first for Hyland. He basically went in there and cleaned out Johnny's pelvis, and the surgery was a success. And so Johnny came back 6 months later. He was in spring training, not even 6 months, maybe 4.5 months later. He was in spring training as a rookie with the Cardinals, and basically it was like his last chance. They were like, "Well, this is it. Let's see, bring him up to the big club, see how he does." And he responded, and the surgery was a resounding success, because the first few years of Johnny's career, he was pretty speedy. He had a lot of extra base hits, doubles, triples. And it's funny because that was forgotten later. He was remembered as a slow, first baseman, lumbering first baseman later in his career. But early in his career, he was a pretty speedy guy.
30 doubles, 40 doubles, 34 doubles, 44 doubles. Shucks, he led the National League with 39 in 1941.
Mm-hmm.
There have always been players throughout history who have this unique ability to hit for average and to hit for power. Obviously, Johnny was one of them. But I think what set him apart was his discipline at the plate. How unusual or how unique was it to have a power hitter like that who could hit for average and not strike out a whole lot.
I think that's that's one of the things that sort of sets him apart in the the pantheon. Sets him apart. People like DiMaggio, Yogi Berra, even Ted Williams, Stan Musial, guys who didn't strike out a lot, who were, Berra, Yogi Berra. You've probably done. He's not forgotten. So, but he was ridiculous with his ability to swing at bad pitches and not strike out. But Mize, he brought this discipline that was a little bit different in the sense that he approached it like a professor, and in that he not only would study pitchers and take the time to say work on his swing, but he would work on his swing with different size bats, and he would order more bats than anybody else, and he would do it not just to have more bats, but because he knew that some of these were going to work better for him in colder climates, in certain cities, in certain humidity, and so he knew what each of these tools were good for, and that's what made him, I think, unique. I mean, there was certainly, it's interesting. You mentioned guys of today, and of course now it's perfectly acceptable for fellas to strike out 200 times a season. I mean, that's par for the course. But and it's it's okay. They're like, well, as long as they're doing whatever sabermetric they need to do. But that aside, the guys back then generally didn't strike out as much. But even among those, his peers, Johnny was among the better players who could hit for distance and not strike out very much. So he was definitely one of the better guys, just behind Joe DiMaggio, I would say, and even Berra. Both of I compare them because if you look at all of their career statistics in terms of home runs and strikeouts, they're somewhat comparable. And you see that, but that was the type of hitter that Johnny was. And that's why it was astounding to me that he was sort of forgotten. People sort of forgot that this guy was dangerous. People in the infield and pitchers didn't forget him. They always knew when he was coming up to the plate.
He was one of the more amazing things to me. His first 6 years he plays with the Cardinals. So he hits 329, 364, 337, 349, 314, 317. Comes out with 19 homers his rookie year, 25, 27, 28, 43, 16. In 1940, he leads the National League with 43 homers, 137 RBI, doesn't win the MVP. How much back then the Cardinals were not like the Cardinals we know today, the Cardinals of the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s. They were not a true contending team, right? They didn't win the World Series every year. They were not a they didn't win the World Series. I guess they contended, but they didn't win. How much was that he did not win the MVP due to the fact that the Cardinals weren't winning the World Series every year?
That was a big part of it. I think in those days, most of the time, the MVP winner was somebody who was on the pennant winning team or close to the pennant. There's one of the things that's inexplicable to me is that you're right. The Cardinals were in a period there where they were between eras, where from the late 20s to the early 30s, they were pretty dominant. They would win a pennant every other year, like 26, 28, 30, and I think 32 and 34 or 31 and 34. So they would win pennants, and they won one of those was a World Series victory. But then they quickly got old, and Johnny arrives just as the team is, they've become a decent team, right? They're nobody's first place team, right? The Giants and the Cubs are the powers, and the Cardinals are, they're a third place team, and also ran. And so he's part of that group of Cardinals that's building for the future, right? They become great again during the war years, during World War II. So he's on those teams that are sort of in that vacuum of, the Cardinals were sort of, oh yeah, they were meh. They were
they finished second or third, but they never finished first.
They never finished first, and so they'd finish out of the running. And I think he got a bad rap. I really do. I think that part of it was like, well, look, and here's why I say that, Warren, because he leaves the team. He gets sent to the Giants after 41. And 41 is a turnaround year for the Cardinals. They come really close to winning the pennant. They win 104 games or 102 games. They lose the pennant by a couple of games to a strong Brooklyn Dodgers team. And the pennant comes down to the last few games of the season, and Johnny is hurt a lot of the year. He's really hurt, but he gets blamed. I've even heard one sports writer say he was gold bricking it. Remember that old phrase about somebody who was laying down on the job, and really he was hurt. He was a power hitter whose one of his fingers was broken, a very painful injury, and then he broke, I think it was his elbow later, but he had these two injuries that slowed him down. And sometimes they were said, if Johnny had been up to full speed, the Cardinals might have caught the Dodgers. And the other complaint that the players had was, well, if Ricky had brought up Stan Musial earlier, who was hitting a ton in the minor leagues, they might have won. So all of these might have beens. All of that to say, Johnny leaves the Cardinals and goes to the Giants. And then the Cardinals wind up winning like 3 pennants over the next 5 years. And they become great again without Johnny Mize.
Well, sticking with the MVP conversation here.
Yes.
The other thing that strikes me is his great year of 1947. 51 home runs, 138 ribbies, bats .302. Let's see, 26 doubles, 2 triples. What is this guy supposed to do? And he finished third in the MVP behind, who was it? Bob Elliott?
Bob Elliott, whose team was only
the Boston Braves.
Yeah.
And Ewell Blackwell, who was with the Reds. I don't understand the justification.
None.
So Blackwell won 20-something games.
Yeah.
My question is this. Was there also something else about Johnny that the writers, the voters, did not like?
Yes.
That prevented him from becoming MVP?
I think you're onto something there. Yes. He had few good friends in the press box. That's not to say that they hated him, but he was one sports writer I interviewed who remembered Johnny. I don't think he covered him. Bob Bragg, a Hall of Fame, sports writer, but Bob grew up in St. Louis and became a longtime St. Louis sports writer. He described Mize as a conversational barber. He would cut it short. He, unless he was in the mood or the conversation was, say, about hitting or something and the thing about, he just was not a talker. And the thing about this that's interesting is Mize was somewhat of a deep thinker. He was not a fool, a bumpkin, but he was very suspicious, I think, of strangers, of the press, and consequently, he was not a favorite. There were a few. I remember reading columns by a few people, Jimmy Cannon, a legendary sports writer, who really loved him, who thought he was just the bee's knees, as they used to say. But that 47 year really bugs me. I can understand 1940 when he had that tremendous year, and I think it was Frank McCormick or Bucky Walters, one of those guys. Yeah. Because that was the pennant when still Mize got robbed. And Bill James would agree with me. But in 47, Bill Elliott was on a 3rd place team, I think, and Mize was on a 4th place. It's not like they were that far apart. And I don't know where the Reds were with I think Blackwell had one of those years that was like, you remember Steve Carlton in 72?
Sure, like
27.
50% of the
Yeah.
Phillies game.
I don't know what the Reds were in 47, but I have a feeling that it was kind of like that. Blackwell was just so dominant that it was like, you got to give this guy.
Yeah,
But
22-8 with a 2.47 ERA. And let's see, the Reds.
Warren Spahn had I think, an equally good year, if not better.
Yeah, it's just it's
Mize got totally robbed. I know. I would say, and I think I put this somewhere in the book in my judgment, in my research. I think he was certainly robbed of one and probably two. You could say two MVPs. But that happened to other guys who were even better. Think of Ted Williams, who won 2 Triple Crowns, and I don't think he won the MVP in either year.
DiMaggio.
And DiMaggio did win like 3, I think. I mean, because
he beat Williams out.
He beat Williams, yes. He was always and it's hard to argue. Those guys were just Olympians,
Yeah. You can always tell from back in the day, from back in the 40s, who the good hitters really, really were by the fact that they went off and served in the war, came back, and sort of picked up right where they left off. There might have been a little downward turn, but then they exploded, right? So the Cardinals trade Johnny Mize. It's just baffling, but I get it. Branch Rickey, you explained all that, unless there were some other underlying reasons for getting rid of him. They trade him to the New York Giants, the baseball Giants, who are, for those who don't know, are now the San Francisco Giants. He plays in 42 for the Giants, has a good year. He hits 305, 26 homers, 110 RBIs, and then he goes off to the service. Not for 1 year, not for 2 years, but for 3 years. So he misses 43, 44, and 45, comes back in 46, and, it's 337 in 101 games with 22 homers and 70 ribbies. That's in a 154-game season. So he missed 53 games, but he missed a third of the season.
Yeah.
Had 22 homers, 70 ribbies, and hit 337, was an all-star. And then the big year, 1947, everything clicked. 51 home runs, 138 ribbies. It's 302. What was it about that year that everything clicked for Johnny Mize?
You know what? It's funny. I actually think the momentum for 47 started in 46. And here's why I say that. As you noted, he hit 337. I can't remember what his on base was pretty good that year. He had it.
On base was 437.
Oh, Mike, I mean, it was one of his best. And he misses a third of the season because of, again, he gets injured a couple of times. But this is why I say it was a momentum builder. Even though he was injured, he was still sort of on this trajectory of, combining power and average. But even though his average was really high that year, it was his power numbers were impressive. He finished 1 home run shy of the home run title. Ralph Kiner won in 46 by 1 home run. And, Mize would have easily won the home run championship that year. And then 47, as you mentioned, everything seems to click. I think that it was I do believe it was the natural progression of what he had begun in 46. He was trying to swing a little bit more for power by now. He was getting used to the Polo Grounds. Remember when he had started in St. Louis, different ballpark, and he learned, I wouldn't say he was a spray hitter, but he was a line drive hitter. He could hit to all fields. And when he was first sold/traded to the Giants, he was a little bit ambivalent because he used to say that, I wasn't a natural pull hitter. The way he would get out of a slump, for example, was to concentrate on hitting the ball back at the pitcher. He was a straightaway hitter. That's what he tried to be. It's what helped his batting eye. But he was such a good hitter and such a disciplined hitter that the more he played in the Polo Grounds, the more he adjusted his swing to pull it for home runs. So he did lose, he shaved points off of his batting average, but he had gotten better at pulling that ball into the shallow right field porch of the Polo Grounds. And so, again, this was another sort of one of the reasons I think it all clicked for him is because he had truly become comfortable in that ballpark. By that time, that was his third season. You know, he had been away at war, of course. That's what is amazing to me, Warren. He was away for 3 years at war, and he sort of continued what he started in 42, this idea of, I'm adjusting to this weird horseshoe ballpark that could work to my benefit. Let me learn how to make that happen. And he did it.
You got to wonder sometimes, these guys that went and served the country in the war, all the time they missed,
Yeah.
what their numbers would have been. I mean, he missed the prime of his career, 30, age 30,
Yep.
age 31, age 32. DiMaggio missed time. Williams missed time. Willie Mays missed time.
Mhm.
You got to wonder sometimes what those numbers would have been. Going back now again to 47, 51 home runs, there was a chase.
Yes.
There was a thought. Talk about that and talk about the pressure he either felt or didn't feel.
Yes.
And Babe Ruth.
Sure enough, he was. It's interesting because that was an important year for the Babe because he got sick that year. It was the year he was battling cancer. And Johnny, of course, had become the toast of New York. He was hitting home runs at this record pace. He was ahead of the Babe's pace for most of the season and well ahead of all challengers until Ralph Kiner in his second year got really hot. He hit like 7 home runs in 4 games at one stretch, and then 8 home runs in another 4-game stretch. And by the end of July, Ralph Kiner and Johnny Mize were neck and neck. They were both ahead of the Babe's pace, and the newspapers would talk about this. They interviewed the Babe, and the Babe would talk about how, boy, if anybody breaks the record, I hope it's Johnny. Somebody will do it someday, and I hope it's Johnny to keep it in the family, that kind of thing. And so it's an exciting time, and an exciting time for baseball because meanwhile, Jackie Robinson has changed the game. Fans are coming out in record numbers that the game had never seen before, mostly to see Jackie, this new phenomenon with the Dodgers, but also to see this incredible home run race between Johnny Mize and Ralph Kiner. The thing that the Babe did that no one else did was in September, he hit something like 17 home runs. He went on a ridiculous tear. So while Johnny and Ralph entered like the end of August, early September ahead of the Babe, they quickly fell off the pace and each of them finished at 51 home runs, 9 homers shy of the Babe. But again, the season was not without its drama. I think there was one game in which Johnny hit, another game in which he hit 3 home runs. One of the things that he was known for doing was hitting 3 home runs. He did 6 times. But it was a storybook season for him. And I think, in my opinion, it was his best season. I mean, just when you think of what he accomplished, that'll never happen again. 20-something, 25,000 major league players in the history of the game, and only one has ever done that.
Yeah. 51 home runs, 42 strikeouts. That's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Ralph Kiner, that's a guy I need to do a show on. I mean, I think probably more people remember him as the announcer and Kiner's Corner.
Yes.
For the New York Mets.
Of course. I lived in New York I'm from New York, and I moved back there anyway, I loved the Mets, watching the Mets and the Yankees. Frankly, I loved watching both of them, but Ralph Kiner had a special place in my heart.
Absolutely. So he has his great season in 47, follows it up with another good season in 1948, and then the Giants got rid of him. they traded him off to the Yankees. Talk about that. What brought that about?
Sure, Johnny got, one of the things that happened to Mize was, and we've seen it happen to other ball players. Think about somebody like Alex Pujols and how quickly he went sort of over the cliff. Right, he had this incredible, in fact, with the Cardinals, but this incredible first 10 years that were and by all accounts, just one of the best careers ever. But you look at how quickly he fell off the cliff. Johnny's decline was similar in that next year, as you mentioned, he had a good year. He hit 40 homers, only struck out 37 times, I think. I think he's one of the two players in history to twice hit 40 or more home runs and strike out less times than he hit homers. Another great trivia question, Ted Kluszewski, who twice hit over 40 home runs and struck out less than 40 times.
That's crazy.
I think that was his record. Anyway, so Mize, by 1949, Leo DeRocher is now immersed as the manager of the Giants. He came along midway through 48, was never a big Mize fan as a manager. When they were teammates back with the Cardinals, they got along fine. And early on, Leo actually wanted to bring Johnny to the Dodgers in the early 40s when he knew the Cardinals were looking to get rid of him before the Giants picked up Mize. Leo DeRocher wanted him for the Dodgers, right? So he liked Mize as a young player, but now that he was older, injured, slower, he didn't like him as much. Mize knew this, and also Mize's performance just frankly dropped off in 49. Injuries caught up with him, bad shoulder that he had injured I think seasons earlier, and his power numbers fell off, his batting average fell off. It was a good time for the Giants to unload him because he was also making a pretty good salary for those days, or at least for those times for the Giants. And so, and again, Leo wanted to build for the future. And here was this 36-year-old guy who was an old 36, and he had a chance to unload him. And he did it. And Casey Stengel had a chance to pick him up, and he did it.
Yeah, I mean, he went to the Yankees, and while he did not enjoy a great career on the field with the Yankees, what he did get to enjoy was postseason play.
Oh, my gosh.
Finally, this guy, Johnny Mize, who's had a long and great career, gets to the Yankees, who were the Yankees at that time. He played in the World Series in 49, 50, 51, 52, and 53. And 52, holy cow, what a postseason. 3 home runs, 6 ribbies, only struck out once, in 15 at bats, so he had a 400 batting average. I mean, what a great season or World Series for Johnny Mize. And his regular season, like you said, he sort of was going downhill, but what a resurrection in the World Series. Talk about that.
Sure. He fit his role perfectly. He moved into this completely new role. When you think about the first part of his career with the Cardinals and the Giants, he was ostensibly an everyday player. Like if he wasn't injured, he was an everyday player, and he expected that. When he got to the Yankees, he understood that this was a deep team, that they had Tommy Henrich, that they had some other great veterans who he respected, and that they were winners. And so he knew he was part of an ensemble performance here. Even DiMaggio was getting older, and he gracefully moved into this part-time role. He knew now that his role was, as my dad adequately explained to me as a kid, as sort of the hired gun. He was the gunslinger who, you remember the movie Shane, the great Western, where the poor town folk who are tired of getting bullied by the bad guy, they hire this gunslinger to come in. Well, that was sort of Johnny Mize. Not that the Yankees were sort of bullies in their own sense, but keep in mind the Yankees had missed the World Series in 48. So 49 was a comeback for them in a sense. And Johnny just fit right in. He got in. In fact, I think when he looked back on his career, his favorite years were with the Yankees, in no small part because of that postseason action. Extra money, he was a pragmatist, so he was glad to make the extra money, but also the excitement. Think about a guy late in his career who's toiled, tried to win. Now he's playing on. He doesn't have to be, and I think it speaks to who Johnny Mize was. He doesn't have to be the ringleader. He was never that guy, and I don't think he could have been that guy. He was much better as part of an ensemble in terms of that championship push. And I think he found his stroke. Again, his batting averages weren't great, but when he got his hits, it's like you look at guys who are like this today. You remember Julio Franco, who played forever, and these guys who got hits at just the right moment. And that became Mize. And what was interesting about 52, I thought, was he hits only 4 home runs that year. And he hits 3 in the World Series.
Yeah. I ask this of a lot of my guests, if you had to compare Mize to a modern ball player, not just statistically, but in style and presence, who comes to mind?
That's it's a tough question because I'm having a senior moment. There's a couple of there's a guy for Milwaukee. You know who I'm talking about. He's a big fella. He's roly-poly. It'll come to me. but he reminds me a little bit of a Mize. But when I think about more recent past, I would say think of a David Ortiz type of player. When I think of that, David, of course, is gone now for at least 6-7 years, but he's a guy that came to mind when I was doing my research. And before David Ortiz, because this is how long I worked on this book, Frank Thomas was a guy I had in mind. You might remember Frank Thomas from the White Sox.
Yeah.
Actually, because I'd started this book, Warren, back in like 2000, 2001, and I had to put it down for like 22 years. Did really nothing with it because I had family to take care of, and had some things to do with work, right? And I finally got a chance. I knew I'd come back to it eventually. But so when I first started on this and started thinking about Johnny Mize, I had a guy like Frank Thomas in mind, who was, again, a first baseman who wasn't known for being a great fielder, but became a great hitter. I thought of Edgar Martinez. These were the guys who were still relevant when I started the book, right? And then as I was getting near to the end and started thinking about finishing this book, around 2021 or so, David Ortiz was still fresh in my mind, and he was a guy that I thought was very much a guy who was more of an everyday player or of a fielder who sometimes reminded me of Mize was Goldschmidt, who's still playing. He's with the Yankees now.
Yeah.
But a guy, again, the Yankees pick up an old player like they've been doing for 70-something years. They kind of established that. If you think about it, go back to the Casey Stengel years. They started that tradition of picking up old role players to help them push them, over the edge, right, to win a championship. Mize was the first of those guys, and a guy who they brought in specifically to be a role player, a pinch hitter, and an occasional defensive player who you could take out for a defensive replacement, or you could bring in late in the game to hit against their best relief pitcher.
He didn't retire. Well, his last year was 1953. He didn't get into the Hall of Fame until 1981.
Yeah.
Why do you think it took so long?
There are a number of reasons, and there are a number of questions about that too, because one of the reasons, and I put this in the book, and this comes from research, and also part of that research involving an old friend of mine, or an old colleague of mine. I would be lying if I said we were like friends, but Joe Posnanski, the baseball writer. We were sports writers for the same string of papers back in the early 90s. So I knew Joe then. And Joe wrote a terrific book called The Baseball 100. And I reached out to him, and if he's always been a kind enough guy, to say, hey, yeah, of course you can use that material. And, of course, proper attribution and all, but I really wanted to get his permission personally, because there was so much in his chapter about Johnny Mize that I loved. And one of the things was he talked about the sports writers' pig-headedness during that era of voting, that Mize wasn't alone. Joe seems to think that Johnny was the second worst, case of being abused by the sports writers. The worst was Archie Vaughn. That's a whole other episode. That would be a fun episode, actually. But all that to say, Mize, he was forgotten. And part of it, I think, goes back to what we talked about earlier with the MVP voting. He wasn't always the most popular guy. But then there were other circumstances. When he was playing, you had to be retired 1 year, and then you would be eligible for the Hall of Fame. When Johnny retired, the next year they changed it to the 5-year rule. So he basically had to wait 6 years, and then because they added the every other year voting rule for about 15 years, there was the Hall of Fame only had a vote for induction every 2 years. So then there were fewer opportunities. By the time you added it all up, he was getting 40% of the vote, I think was the most he ever got. He came along at a time when there was a lot of great players, including some, again, who didn't get in for some reason, and including some who you think would have been first ballot who had to wait. People like Yogi Berra. I think even DiMaggio may have had to wait next year. I don't think he was a first ballot guy, or he might have been victim to the 5-year rule. But all this to say, I think I think the fact that Johnny played on 3 different teams, I think that, like a sports writer couldn't go back and say, well, Johnny is one of the greatest Cardinals of all times. He only played with them for 6 years. Johnny's one of the greatest Giants of all. Oh, it was only with them for 5.5, 6 years. So that there was that reconciliation. And then finally, his last 5 years with the Yankees, even though he helped them win 5 World Series, as we noted, his numbers were down. He was a part-time player. He was a role player. And role players are not Hall of Famers. And so I think a lot of voters were looking at that. They completely forgot his 10, 11 full seasons as a full-time player in which he hit a ton. And they forgot the 3 years that he missed during World War II, without which he could have hit close to 500 home runs easily, driven in 1,700 runs easily, had 2,600 hits easily. All these career numbers would have been larger. Even his batting average would have been given a boost for having been in those 3 years of prime hitting years. Anyway, all that to say, so all of those reasons and probably some others kept him from getting voted in by the writers, sending him to the veterans ballot. And I think in his 2nd or 3rd year of eligibility on the veterans ballot, he got in. And again, these veterans were putting in a lot of people who didn't make it on the writers ballot. So they had some work to do.
Well, for what it's worth, I think he's deservedly in the Hall of Fame. Jerry, you wrote a great book, Big Cat. I encourage everybody listening or watching to grab a copy. Terrific book. And I want to thank you so much for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
Thanks a lot, Lauren. I appreciate it.
Johnny Mize made a name for himself with the St. Louis Cardinals, and he was great with the New York Giants. But his career with the New York Yankees is where he might best be known. That's where he won 5 World Series titles as a part-time player. Thanks again to Jerry Grillo, and thanks to all of you for tuning in, and I'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
The heel gets the heat. The babyface gets the cheers. But the jobber gets, well, the job done. And speaking of jobbers, Barry Horowitz wasn't there to win titles. He was there to build them. By selling every move, every storyline, and every new star that stepped into the ring. He was the secret sauce. And now, he's the headline in his new book titled, Wrestling is My Gimmick, My Life on the Wrong Side of the 3 Count. This memoir is a deep dive into wrestling's most underrated position and the man who made it an art form. Whether you're a fan of wrestling, a fan of sports history, or just love a great story, this book is for you. Again, that's Wrestling is My Gimmick by Barry Horowitz. Grab your copy today before the count strikes 3.